Okay everyone, so today we are going to actually go over a common complaints that you're going to see in this generation Hyundai Tucson. This is a generation that ultimately had a few failures and a lot of success. The Tucson's reliability rating is around 4.7 out of 5, so ultimately it does well in that regards. However, that wasn't always the case. Hyundai did have to make some adjustments in order to actually get those numbers. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about why those complaints were pretty severe, and we'll also talk about some minor complaints that you can kind of look over if you're looking for a family SUV. So first things first, we'll talk about some of the major ones, and then we'll go ahead and go into the nitty-gritty details. Biggest thing you're going to notice on this Tucson, especially in the 2019 and 2020 models, gas mileage. With the implementation of the 2.4-liter four-cylinder, the gas mileage did drop 1 mile per gallon in the city, bringing you down to a 22 mile per gallon city and a 28 on the highway. However, I did not seem to get those numbers as I was traveling from Laughlin, and ultimately in the first 90 miles, I actually used over a quarter of a tank of fuel. Now granted, we're not sure if the fuel tank is shaped weird to where you use certain quarters a lot quicker, as on the way out there I actually used less than a quarter tank and I went 90 miles. So it's one of those things where I was kind of odd that it would use the first half tank of gas more quickly, but at the same time, it could just be like a control thing. I'm not quite sure. That kind of sounds stupid coming from my mouth because honestly, it just should read the gas tank as it is. But we never know. Shapes actually do make a difference as the gas gauge will travel differently depending on how much volume is in there. So with that, gas mileage on this is not the best. The 2.0 will fare a little bit better, but you will notice a lack of power. So you kind of have to choose whether or not you want power versus fuel economy. But then again, even the fuel economy on the 2.0 is not that great. You really only get 1 mile per gallon better in the city. And then if you have the all-wheel drive model, surprisingly, the 2.0 does worse than the 2.4 all-wheel drive in terms of gas mileage. So pick your battles, get the 2.4. It's a better engine overall. Granted, it's probably a little bit less reliable due to the short block problems, but you will notice a big difference and the car will actually feel a lot more comfortable. So it's one of those things where the 2.4 actually is by far the better engine, despite the next complaint we're going to talk about is the startup noise. The startup noise on the 2.4 liter is actually rather loud, and it's one of those things where people are like, is there something wrong? It kind of sounds like a dying cat. This actually happened to me on this vehicle as well as the Sonata I test drove on the channel, and ultimately it's a-okay. That is actually a normal noise, and unless if your engine actually blows up, I wouldn't really worry about it. So unfortunately it's just loud upon startup and it's only when the engine's cold. Then after that it will quiet down, so don't worry about that too much. Just engines sometimes have to make noise. So you kind of just go from there. But not a bad engine by any means. Again, it's not the most fuel efficient, so I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about in terms of the gas mileage. As you can see here, this is a trip from Laughlin and ultimately a trip to and from work. As you can see, that's how much gas I've used, and we've traveled around 110 miles. So how I have 220 miles tank, I'm not quite sure, but as you can see, my average has been 24.8 mixed city and highway driving, which is kind of what EPA estimates it. However, when I was on the highway, I was only averaging around 22. Granted, there was some fault of my own on that because I did need to do some passing and I went uphill and I didn't do it as nicely as I should have. However, the gas mileage on this is quite surprisingly bad. As you can see, that's just really crazy that I would use a little over a quarter tank, almost to a half now, in just only, essentially it was 92 miles when it was at 3/4, just a little bit below, and then now I've gone about 20 miles today and it's a little bit lower. So just something to think about. It's not the best in gas, but ultimately it does make up for it in other regards. You do have an SUV. It's a safe, reliable SUV. You're not going to have many problems with it. So we're good there. Now granted, you're not going to have any problems with it because they made some changes. And I will talk about those changes right now. The 7-speed dual clutch was probably the biggest complaint in this particular model of Tucson. Now, do keep in mind that they did not have this in the 2011 to 2016 models. This actually no, this is the first generation of 2016, or first model of 2016. So 2015, they did not have that combination, but the 1.6 liter turbo with the 7-speed dual clutch automated manual transmission was an absolute fiasco. For some apparent reason, the Tucsons and some of the Konas, but not all of them, started having just major transmission problems, and it was just the car was too heavy and it was burning up the clutches, and then people tried to go off-roading in it when the dual clutch automated manual is not meant for that. So they did replace it with a 6-speed torque converter automatic. This is the one that they've been using now for God knows how long, and it's ultimately a very reliable transmission. You won't have many problems with it as long as you do your services. But with that 6-speed implementation, I think that also brought the gas mileage down, because ultimately we know what would actually work best in this, and it's a CVT transmission. But ultimately, I'm glad that Hyundai decided not to be dumb, because then they're going to lose the Tucson buyers to like Subaru and all that stuff. A lot of people are moving away from them because they're using the gearbox of a snowmobile. So yeah, that's about it there. Another common complaint, the reason why I'm standing outside of the vehicle, is the vehicle looks rather roomy out from the outside, and it doesn't look too cramped inside. But the problem with that is the interior space does not compete with the competitor, or with like the Honda CR-V, for example. If I go into the back seat, I can fit 3 people in here comfortably, and we also do have reclining seats back here. But if I did have a child, if I did have to put car seats in here, or if I did have to actually like cart people around, then I have an issue, because the coupe styling over here makes your tall folks a little bit cramped. As you get in, you're gonna hit your head, and then afterwards you're gonna get in and you're gonna feel like, oh man, my head is actually touching this little coupe styled headliner here. This has been an issue actually since the 2011 Elantra came out, that Hyundai decides to make the front end look rather large, and then they move to the back end and things are kind of cramped in. So it's one of those things where although it's a nice sleek design on the outside, on the inside not so much. And this actually carries over into the trunk space, which I'm not necessarily too mad about, because we don't necessarily want this to be too high and look like a Pontiac Aztek, because then we're gonna have bigger issues. Trunk space wise, it is a little cramped in the back. It's not crazy small, but the thing is, again, your front end is rather large. The car sort of does a dipping motion like this, and then so everything in the back is kind of like shallower. So then you run into the issue of, oh, it looks like I can get that dresser in this car, but then I actually try to put it in and it's literally like an absolute disaster. So not necessarily the best combo here. If you want to get a Santa Fe for space, that probably would be your better option. And this is why the Santa Fe wins the war, is because the Tucson, although it's an amazing looking starter SUV, the Santa Fe just offers more. So you kind of have to look at it that way. Santa Fe also gets a little bit better gas mileage, surprisingly, with that 8-speed automatic, which I think they should put in the Tucson, as this would ultimately increase their numbers. So with that, folks, this is the 2020 Tucson. However, this generation Tucson has carried back to 2016. Here are some major and minor complaints on it, not necessarily things that you could like fault the car drastically for, besides the 7-speed dual clutch disaster, but otherwise it overall is a good vehicle to have. Like, I'm not saying don't buy it, but I'm just saying know what your needs are before you actually go for something like this, because then you're going to end up being disappointed when the car doesn't meet your room needs, when it doesn't meet your fuel economy standards, so on and so forth. Look at your competitors. So that's about it. If anybody has any questions, by all means, let me know, and we will kind of go from there. You guys have a good one.